Very good to be back with you again. My name is Stephen Landale, and it's a pleasure to be here and have the honor of welcoming those of you who are visiting here for the first time. This is my third time speaking here. I'm an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister, served UU congregations for a dozen years, and have been a hospice chaplain for the past 6.5 years. In 2004, while serving as minister of Bell Street Chapel, a UU congregation in Providence, Rhode Island, I received a letter from an inmate in a nearby medium security prison. I'll call the inmate Jack. Jack said he'd found his new faith, Unitarian Universalism. I'd heard of people finding Jesus in jail, but not people finding Unitarian Universalism. He explained that on television he saw members of my congregation in a bell ringing ceremony during a worship service, calling for marriage rights for all adults, regardless of the gender of their partner. He learned more about Unitarian Universalism and became a member of the Church of the Larger Fellowship, which anybody can join, but I believe was founded to serve primarily those who are not near a UU congregation or, like Jack, are unable to attend one. And it actually has a pretty strong prison ministry now. In my subsequent letters and then meetings with Jack, he made it clear that what drew him after seeing this television segment was our first principle, respecting the inherent worth and dignity of every person. He wrote, "You believe in my worth and dignity and everyone's," he said, "and you're acting on that faith." This was a principle Jack was striving to put at the center of his life. So for 3 years, until I left for Oregon, I visited Jack and then volunteered to lead monthly worship services and lead discussions at the prison. His letter prompted me to live out my commitment to the inherent worth and dignity of every person in ways I never could have foreseen when I took the position in Rhode Island. So, for those of you who have been here before, I'm wondering, how did you first hear of Unitarian Universalism and what led you to this congregation? Most importantly, did you then, or do you now use this community or another to help yourself become a better person in alignment with these values? The first time I went to a Unitarian Universalist church, I was in my about 21 years old. The signboard out front read, quote, "Christmas, why it's not just for children," end quote. I was raised Catholic in Pennsylvania, still maintain very close ties with that church. I went to college, though, and did not attend church. And now, in December, following my college graduation, a friend was leading me by the hand to a different kind of church. This was the First Unitarian Society of Ithaca, New York. When I stepped inside the building, it reminded me of a Protestant church, perhaps Methodist, which I'd attended with a friend, but without any cross. And much of the service reflected what I later learned to be Unitarian Universalism's Protestant roots: choir, minister, pews, organ, and the sermon sandwich, a sermon with a hymn before and after. But what was said was completely different than anything I'd ever heard or imagined in church. In fact, I wondered if a minister could say the things that the Reverend Jack Taylor said that day and not be fired by God, or not have fire rained upon him. He said that Christmas is the time we give thanks to those clever disciples and gospel writers, because if they had never invented those great stories about Jesus being born a virgin and resurrected from the dead, we never would have heard the teachings of this great man. His message was so shocking to me that I couldn't really understand what I'd heard until I left the building, walking home. Did he really say that? And not get struck by lightning? And this place is a church, and he's the minister? So out of curiosity, if nothing else, I came back. I felt a spiritual void in my life, and I needed faith that resonated with my mind as well as with my heart. Now, in hindsight, I can see that what attracted me initially were the hallmarks of American Unitarianism. Freedom of belief, use of religion in religious inquiry, with nothing too sacred to be examined, and a belief in Jesus as a human prophet who, along with other prophets, calls us to deeper and more loving relationships with others, with ourselves, and with that which holds us all together, with God. A couple of months later, I moved to Washington, D.C., and after some time found my way to another UU congregation, All Souls Church, very historic church on 6th. I attended for 2 years. There I found some things missing in the other congregation. Racial diversity, use of the word God to name that which we reverence above all else, something larger and more mysterious than a big white bearded guy in the clouds, something more akin to love or to truth, but larger than even those, and to some having the qualities of a personality. In both congregations, I found religious diversity, another hallmark of Unitarian Universalism. While the word God was hardly ever used in Ithaca, and was used fairly often at All Souls, it was understood that people had different understandings of the word, and that many did not use or resonate with that word, and that was okay. And so other religious language was used as well. Now, people who feel burnt by more conservative religions or left cold by them are often ecstatic for a while when they discover Unitarian Universalism with its emphasis on freedom, reason, and religious diversity. I've even heard people in this early kind of honeymoon phase, if even they call it that, saying, wow, we get to believe whatever we want, and we can do a little of everything, cool. Now, when your only experience of religion has been narrow-minded and judgmental, and sometimes even abusive, it's exciting to find one that values freedom of belief, use of reason, appreciation of multiple religious sources, one where your beliefs can change, but you can still stay in the same church. It's quite a remarkable thing. Indeed, those things are enough to satisfy people for some years. But over time, I've seen this in a dozen years of ministry, it seems we need something more as well. We want not only freedom, but guidance. We want not only truths to explore, but truths to have to be true to. Once we've discovered our truths, something that holds us then accountable to them. We want something that demands us to be our best self and helps us find it with others. While we want the freedom to explore a variety of religious paths, we also want want to be guided on those paths by something worthy of our highest loyalties, something we can hold on to through hard times. We want something real from religion, something to comfort us in our illnesses, our losses, our times of trial, something that helps us know when the world is full of violence and hypocrisy, that there is a movement towards health, respect, and wholeness, actually many in different parts of the world. And we are part of one such movement. In the 1980s, the Unitarian Universalists from all over North America gathered to form principles to guide our living faith, as Unitarians and Universalists had done separately throughout each tradition's history before their union in 1961. After much debate and deliberation, I repeat, after much debate and deliberation, we truly do honor the democratic process. They selected 6 principles and later added a 7th. We spoke them in our responsive reading, and you have them depicted beautifully with art over there. I love that. Now, out of these 7 principles, I come to notice, and others have reflected as well, that people, if they remember 2 of them, almost always remember the same 2. Numbers 1 and 7. So I invite you to please repeat after me, first and last principles. We covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Respect for the interdependent web of all life of which we are a part.
Respect for the interdependent web of all life of which we are a part.
Now, Unitarian Universalism is often criticized for not having a clear doctrine. Indeed, we do value covenants, agreements about how we're going to be in the world, more than creeds, more than detailed descriptions of things unseen and unprovable. Yet our first and 7th principles speak to our religious imaginations more than the others, helping us to visualize hidden dimensions of life, metaphors, if you will, the inherent worth and dignity, and a web of connections holding everything together. These 2 principles, in that way, come closest to creedal statements. To say one covenants to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every human being is saying that one believes that worth and dignity are inherent to each human being, unless one is covenanting to affirm and promote a lie. And some people look at it as affirming and promoting something you want to be true. But still, this is really a statement of belief, and not one shared by all traditions, although shared by many. Respect for the interdependent web of life presumes that one believes there is such a thing as an interdependent web of all life, and to say of which we are a part is different than saying, for instance, which was created for us. It's a strong implied sense. This is not a hierarchy. We are a part of a web of life. That's a statement. So these 2 principles provide a concise summary of who we are, what we believe, and to what we are loyal. The inherent worth and dignity of every person, the interdependent web of life of which we are a part. And of course there's wiggle room. If you don't like the web imagery, which came up in the 1980s, my UU history professor and seminary, who also taught preaching and pastoral care, or weddings and funerals, he didn't like it. He didn't like the web imagery. But he still believed very strongly in interdependence. So, and sometimes that principle can be summarized as interdependence, but I like that there's kind of something that speaks to our religious imaginations, the web. Now, lay leaders in one of my former congregations led a class that was produced by the UUA, Unitarian Universalist Association. It's called Articulating, wow, I can't even say articulating, that's funny. Articulating Your UU Faith. It was written by Barbara Wells and Jocko B. Tenhove, 2 ministers. Unfortunately, I left it at home. Maybe I'll bring it next time. But the cover art, I'll just show you, depicted the 7 principles as an arch, okay? And going, say, was your left here. The first principle, the column on the left side. The second, the third. The fourth was a keystone, which is a free and responsible truth for search and meaning, which people often identify with very strongly. 5th, 6th, and the 7th for interdependence, some arch. It's a very helpful visualization. And so you can think of the first and seventh principles then as the two pillars of Unitarian Universalism. We need them all. And after those pillars, the others can be built upon them. Okay? So, given our belief in and dedication to the inherent worth and dignity of every person and to our interdependence, how can one not strive for justice, equity, and compassion in human relations? Second principle, how can we demonize another person when we know deeply that she or he has inherent worth and dignity, though hidden, and what happens to him or her touches us as well, since we are part of the same web. With these two pillars as our foundation, how could we not strive to build a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all? The sixth principle. It was very nice to sit up here and hear about more of what you're doing in the community, and I'd like to relate the first and seventh principles to some of what you're doing. So, nonviolent communication, for instance, NVC. I took a class with Marshall Rosenberg, and some of this relate, or principles, some of this distinctive features. One thing he says is he feels it's so important in nonviolent communication. They emphasize listening a lot, but also in speaking. And one thing he said that really stayed with me is he said, I will never do something out of a sense purely of obligation. It needs to come from a place of a deep alignment and desire. He said extremely, he said, I won't pass somebody the ketchup if I feel the least drop of resentment in it. You know, very kind of extreme statement, but very interesting. And I think of that as really kind of a radical way of respecting our own inherent worth and dignity, kind of purity, that we need to be coming from a place in our actions that's respectful of the other and also respectful of ourselves. Now there's parallels to this in Jesus' teachings and others as well, but you can think of it that way. Also, you get a strong sense in NVC of not wanting the communication between us, but also kind of the space between us and our relationships to be polluted in any way. For instance, by resentment. Okay? And I think of the seventh principle with that. The interdependent web. Like, we want our web to be kind of clean, you know. And NVC is a wonderful way of practicing this. Communication skills, but it's a way of kind of strengthening your commitment to these UU values, but also coming more consciously from the UU values. You may approach NVC work a little differently, more strongly. Habitat for Humanity. I mean, you can't do that work and not feel a deeper sense of connection with others who might be in a worse plight than you. And you know, many of us in this country are one or two paychecks away from not having a home. So you know, and it's also a physical way of having that connection, not just up here, but in our hearts and bodies, as is dance, what you're doing. So, and obviously a radical way of affirming somebody's sense of dignity, to have a good home of their own. You know, I mean, being homeless is hard, and it affects our dignity. And one of the greatest things FDR did during the Depression was get people working again. And, you know, it could have just sent people checks. It would have been more efficient than doing all those public works projects. But, you know, we got people get a sense of dignity again, could work and contribute. It's so important. So while the language of these two pillars is modern, one may find their roots, though, in Unitarianism and Universalism, separate before the merger. The Unitarian half of our name dates back at least to 1819, when William Ellery Channing preached a sermon called Unitarian Christianity. Closely related anti-Trinitarian, so not Trinitarian theologies, go back over 1,700 years. In the United States, the Unitarian heresy declared that Jesus was less than God at first, and eventually came to declare that Jesus was human fully, like us. And so the doctrine of the Trinity was rejected. the name Unitarian was initially an insult given by the Trinitarians, saying, "Hey, you Channing, you're a Unitarian." I came out and said, "Yeah, you're right." Preached in Unitarian Christianity. Now, we often focus, it's kind of interesting that the name Unitarian in a lot of ways speaks to what was rejected, the Trinitarian thinking. And I think it's a little unfortunate, and often you use are more strongly identified with what we're rejecting. I think it's more important to look at what we're affirming. So what's affirmed in Unitarianism strongly, and it's affirmed in other traditions too, it's not unique, but it's affirmed in our own way, human nature. For Unitarians then and now, calling Jesus human is not an insult. We all have a spark of the divine. If we strive to live as he lived, we fan that spark into a fire. Unitarianism affirms Jesus as, along with the rest of us, human, but with a spark of the divine. In the words of William Ellery Channing, called the father of American Unitarianism, we each have a likeness to God. If you like that phrase, I'll come back and preach on it. This theology I see as the antecedent of our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And now the other half of our tradition, Universalism. In the 3rd century, there were many devout Christians who followed a biblical scholar named Origen, who taught that all souls were united with God in heaven. It's very important. It's inaccurate to say Christianity in the 1st or 2nd century. You'd have to say Christianities. There was a lot of variety of practice and theology, and it wasn't until about 300 that they decided to have a clear doctrine. And that was so the Roman Empire could have a clear faith, basically. Now this doctrine that all souls would be reunited with God in heaven became known as universal salvation. Now, it was declared a heresy in 325 when the Nicene Creed was hammered out. And then Universalism reemerged during the Reformation in Europe, and it came to the United States from England. At the heart of historic Universalism is a faith in an all-loving God, not a God of vengeance, or not a God who's both. In Universalist theology, we are all God's children. Universalism proclaims a radical solidarity of the human race. We're all in this together. You've got it really nicely said in your order of service in a way I've never seen in any other UU congregation. You've got it in front of you, I can't find it now. There we go. Yeah. Unitarian, one God, one Spirit, one power of love, but I also add that positive understanding of humanity. Universalism, no one's left behind. We're all in this together. Now, with this faith, Universalism in America became focused more on heaven, or at least as much, or if not more, on heaven on earth. And we're all in this together. So the first doctor to treat alcohol as a disease was a Universalist, Benjamin Rush, who was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. The founder of the Red Cross was also Clara Barton, and many other American leaders in healthcare, justice, and peace. In fact, Universalism was a huge tradition in America up until about 1870. What happened is its central tenet of everybody going to heaven, maybe there's not a hell at all, essentially became adopted by most Protestants. So Universalism dwindled in numbers because in some ways it has succeeded and become adopted by the majority of Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, etc., in practice, if not in formal belief. So this faith I see especially alive, Universalism, in our 7th principle, the interdependent web of life of which we are a part. We're all in this together. We are all born of the same great source. No one left behind. So, you may find more sophisticated theologies or philosophies to live by, but how far astray could you go if you walked through life holding in every moment, or as much as you can, an awareness and a genuine respect for the dignity of each person, and a respect for the unseen web of connections uniting us all, a deep felt sense of our solidarity? Imagine what your life would be like if these values regularly shaped your interactions. Maybe they do already to a large degree. Now think for a moment of all the changes that have taken place in our country in the last couple of years. Imagine if there were a voice as strong as those on the religious right, a voice questioning, protesting, affirming, and when necessary, demanding that these principles not be violated. So what attracted me initially to Unitarian Universalism was its belief, freedom of belief, its intellectual edge, its search for truth. I still value these qualities. They are kind of the basis of the free and responsible faith, and the imagery, they're the keystone. But what gives me most hope is the transformative power of Unitarian Universalism, which I've seen it many times. In a sense, it saves. It doesn't save us from hell and afterlife and an imagined hell. It can and does save us from the personal hells of isolation and depression, from the hells of hatred and violence and apathy. We are all behind bars of some sort. Our faith in a spark of divinity within each person and in our interdependence can release and save us from these hells. And our faith has the potential to work with others to help our society from greed, apathy, exclusion, and even cruelty. At its best, Unitarian Universalism, with its commitment to affirm and uphold the inherent worth and dignity of every person and to respect the interdependent web of all life of which we are a part, this can save us from the worst parts of human nature. It helps us see the divine light shining throughout all of life. Scripture is everywhere. Our faith strives to create on earth what our Universalist ancestors believed happens after death, the gathering of all souls, no one left behind, together in the embrace of a God we know as love. In closing, I invite you now to join with me in the spirit of prayer or of meditation or simply of mindfulness, if you wish. Great mystery, source of life and renewal, light within each of us, quivering web, reminding us that we are all in this together. We turn to you now. What a blessing it is to be alive. Yet there is so much about our own lives we would change, and oh so much in the world. Yet here we are, breathing together in shared hope of living with greater intentionality and compassion. This is a good thing. As we strive to help the human community live with respect for itself and for the earth that is our home, may we always come from a place of gratitude, an appreciation for the mysterious threads that bind each to each. May our convictions and passions not become finger-pointing, self-righteous accusations. May we conduct ourselves with the dignity we work to preserve. May we know the wholeness we seek for the world is not ours to impose, but to reveal as a spiritual people. Amidst all the brokenness in the world and in our own lives, there is a hidden wholeness, a healing that comes when we know ourselves as children of the same great source. When awareness of this hidden wholeness comes to us, may we cup our hands gently and hold it, and share it, with or without words, with others. Blessed be, and amen.